My hands are cold. So today we're talking about the histogram and all that entails. So yeah, let's jump right into Lightroom and see what it's about. Alright, so we're in Lightroom right now, and if you look up here, we have our histogram tab. It is the first tab among many other ones that allows you to edit in Lightroom. So these are all your other tabs. But today we're just going to focus on this one, which is the histogram tab. So what is the histogram? Essentially, the histogram is a graph that shows you a bunch of different levels within your photo, and it really just tells you what's in your photo in a chart form. To break down what the histogram does, we're first going to look at this first little tab here, which is just labeled basic. And so the basic tab is an overview of exposure, contrast, highlights, your shadows, your whites, and your blacks. And then there's another little section called the presence, which we're not going to really worry about too much right now. So if you take your mouse and you hover it over your histogram tab, you'll see that it highlights different sections. Okay, so from left to right, you have your blacks first in the first section. The second section, you have your shadows. The third section, you have exposure. The fourth is highlights, and the fifth is whites. So as you can tell, the histogram is divided into 5 sections, which are also consequently in the basic tab. So whenever you go and hover over one of them, it will highlight that section in the basic tab. And then you'll also see that there are colors in here. These colors are divided into 3 groups, or really there's 4, because all this has to do with the luminance. So the gray color that you see on your graph is just luminance itself. That is not it is not a specific color. It is all the colors combined. Okay, so that is affected down here in your HSL and your color tab. Now we're not going to dive too much into this, but essentially all these colors have luminance values, and that's just how bright they are, how bright the colors are. So up here you can see the readings of those individual values. Now the other 3 values, I've mentioned one, the gray one, which is total overall reading of your luminance values of how bright the image is. The other 3 are red, green, and blue. RGB is so there's different color charts, I think is what's labeled. Might be wrong on that. But there's different ways that your camera or your editing software determines color. So you have the CYMK color process, and then you also have the RGB. So in Lightroom, we're working with RGB. You might be able to change that in your preferences, but that's not something you need to worry about right now. All you need to know is that in the histogram, it is read by RGB. And you can even see this when you take your cursor and you go into your picture. In the histogram, or rather right up under it, there is an R, a G, and a B. So wherever you put your cursor, it will tell you the exact color values that make up that pixel. So right where I have mine at right now, it says that, see, it's reading right here. It says it's 24, 20, and 10 of those color values. So all of these can be affected down in here. Now you'll also notice that there's more colors than just red, green, and blue. Where there are other colors, that's where the red, green, or blue color values overlap, and that will read as other colors and their values. Alright, so I've pulled up another image, an image of, this is unedited, with a dog in the field. It has some highlights and some shadows, so I can kind of show you how the histogram works and how you would use it. So to begin, you don't really use the histogram as much as you read the histogram. As soon as you open up a photo in Lightroom, it's good to check out the histogram to see what you should be doing to it. So when you look at the histogram, you can say, okay, do I need to increase the exposure? Do I need to raise the highlights, drop the highlights, bring out the blacks, etc., etc.? And though you can actually do these in the histogram itself by those 5 sections that I mentioned earlier, it's better to work in the basic tab to work on those. So firstly, looking at the histogram, you want to look at the top two corners, left and right, you have these two little triangles, and what they do is they show you your shadows and your highlights, if they're peaking or not, and so or clipping. And so if they are highlighted in white, that means that they are clipping. And so you can actually hover over them or click them to see where they're clipping at. And essentially when your highlights or shadows are clipping, that just means that you're losing detail in those areas and you want to kind of even it out more, or bring some brights to the shadows or tone down your highlights so that you have more detail in your image. So right here you can tell that we are losing a bit of detail in our shadows, and we kind of already knew that just by looking at the photo. A lot of times you'll already know this by looking at the picture. Again, a histogram just kind of allows you to read that. So when we click that, we see that down here there are a few spots where it's fully black and clipping. And so now what we're going to do is we just simply, if you look up here, this is our blacks. So we can just go down to the blacks tab and raise that if we really wanted to, and that should fix the problem. It's no longer clipping, right? But another thing you can do is just raise your exposure, and that'll take away that issue. Now, once doing that, you can now see that our highlights are kind of blown out. It's not reading in the whites that they're overexposed, but they certainly are pretty bright. So now what we would do is bring down your highlights, and that's kind of fixed both problems, allowing you to have detail in your highlights and detail in the blacks, and it's evened out the photo a lot more. Another thing your histogram will tell you is your exposure setting. And so if your histogram is generally to the left, then most of your image is likely underexposed. Now, there are those scenarios where most of your objects in the image are going to be black, and so it would be towards the left because those are darker objects. However, in most scenarios, if your histogram reads to the left, then it will generally be overexposed. A simple way to fix this is to hover over the center of the histogram, which is your exposure, or to go down to your exposure slider in your Basics tab, and just bring that up a stop or two stops, however much, just kind of bring it over until it reads even across your histogram. And that should be a pretty good exposure setting. You can also just look at the image and see, okay, can I see the detail again in the shadows? Is it being brought out? And so on and so forth. To check this, you can just simply, again, hover over your triangle in the top left, and that will show you your shadows and where they're clipping. And you can just bring that up, continuing with your exposure, or you can affect your shadows tab or your blacks tab. Alright, so I've moved to another photo to showcase the highlights and when they're blown out and how you can kind of fix that and what that means for your image. So, if you're first off just looking at the histogram and nothing else, if your histogram shows most of your data is to the right, then that means that your photo is likely blown out, likely has a lot of highlights in it, and may even be way overexposed. But even more so means that it will probably be very flat and not consisting of a lot of detail or contrast. And contrast is really just a difference between lights and darks. And so if it's all the way to the right of the photo, then you're not really getting that. So, disclaimer, though this is a creative decision and sometimes you want this look, a way to fix this would be to mess around with your exposure or your highlights tabs until you read your graph mainly stretched throughout instead of just to the right. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reset this photo. Although I like this edit and I like how blown out it is, I actually want it this way. So that's my creative decision, but I'm gonna reset it and show you how you may be able to fix it and maybe bring back some of those highlights, some of the detail in the highlights. So in the original image, you can already tell that around my head, it is very white. So we'll go up here and we'll see what's white and what's clipping. So we can click these triangles and it'll highlight it. So it's actually showing that the only blown out portion is right here on my ear and in my hair. So this part, there should still be some detail in there. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go up here, and the great thing about the histogram is you can actually use it to edit your photos instead of using the sliders, but generally I use the sliders. So it's up here in the whites is where most of our detail is being lost. So I'm gonna bring those whites down And then I'm also gonna bring the exposure down, and you can see some of the blues coming back to it. And then I'm gonna bring back, keep it probably about right there. Then I'm gonna bring back some of these shadows and some of the blacks, and maybe even some of the whites before it starts clipping too much. It might not clip actually. Yeah, I'm actually gonna bring those whites up. So we've kind of fixed the problem of detail just by manipulating a few of the sliders, and it's honestly looking pretty good right there. If you wanted to bring even more detail back, you can bring the highlights down and continue with bringing the shadows up even more, maybe even the exposure up a little bit more, and to finally end the edit and maybe make it look a little bit more warm, because there's the sun. You can bring your you can bring your temperature up, and there you have it. So that's before and that's after, and that's how you kind of fix your blown out issue that your histogram showed you. Now it's still reading that's blown out, and if you look at before again, it very much so was. So there's not too much you can do without losing value in those shadows. But since the graph now reads across the whole entirety instead of just in one section, that's how you kind of know that you have fixed your problem. All right, moving on, we have one last thing to discuss. We've kind of already mentioned it a little bit with our color channels, the red, green, blue, and then just the luminance in total. We also have a saturation value. So in looking at those individual color channels, you'll see different spikes in those color channels. And so if you look at just this individual green one right here, you can see that it's kind of high. And if we go down, and here, actually an easy and quick way to show you this is to just go to your saturation tab and drop it all the way down. What that's going to do is going to take out all your color and leave you with your luminance value in your graph only, and that's all that's going to be there. So this is kind of a good way to see where your highlights and everything stand. Now if you bring that if you bring that saturation back up and then you bring it all the way up to 100, you'll see the change that it's made. It's kind of spiked and somewhat evened out in some of the other regions of those individual colors. You can see how those move whenever I move the slider. And so one thing that you can do to affect your saturation if you don't like how it is, and you see how it is in the reading, we have a lot of blue values in this image. If we want to take out those blues, all you do is you go down to your blue tab in the HSL/color panel, and you go to your, really it's the luminance, but your saturation is a part of it. If you want to completely get rid of it, you just take your saturation, tone it all the way down, and that'll get rid of all of it, and you'll see how the histogram is affected. It's gotten rid of all of this shade of blue. Now there are still some blues in there, and that can be resolved by changing the aqua. And what's left in the blues is just a mixture of your other colors. So we'll just bring that back up to its normal color levels. If you go to your luminance tab now and you bring that all the way down, you can also see how it affects it, and how a lot of our highlights and a lot of our whites were actually made up of blue values. And it's actually shifted the graph all the way to the left, to where a lot of our shadows and our blacks are now found, or really our midtones are found in the blue values. And if you go back to the luminance of the aqua, you'll see what it does there as well. It's shifted it even farther to the left. So yeah, overall, a histogram chart just really allows you to see different color values, the highlights, exposure, blacks, your whites, and allows you to read that in a chart version. It's a great tool, so I hope you've learned more about the histogram and about Lightroom today. Hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed making it. If you liked it, give it a like. If you disliked it, give it a dislike. Comment, tell me things. Hope your day's going well, and yeah, peace.